We will examine two of the most dangerous stories in history. First, a team stranded helplessly at a height of 37 meters was attacked by 1,200 African honeybees and hung there in agony for hours. Second, a diver refused to abandon his friend after the friend suffered a seizure several meters underwater, even though his own air supply was running out. We don't yet know if they survived, but one thing is certain: no one would want to be in their shoes. Welcome to Cave Tragedies. Can you withstand 1,200 bee stings? Isn't that medically impossible? What if you can't escape? Every second you move means hundreds of new stings. At 37 meters high, suspended by a rope, with your only option being to wait for death, you're probably in a safe place right now. At home, in your bed, maybe under your blanket. Watching this video will give you the creeps. You're probably in a safe place. You'll turn off the screen and go back to your safe life. Whether they will return is a big mystery. June 9th, 2007. In the arid lands of Mexico, a massive sinkhole known as Pozo de Gavilon, 90 meters deep and 60 meters in diameter. Its walls are covered in steep limestone, its bottom filled with dark waters, and beneath those waters lie cave passages waiting to be discovered. Helios Medina and 9 friends had arrived that morning, filled with excitement for their new exploration trip. The group had 2 separate objectives. Medina and 4 of his friends were certified cave divers. They would explore the underwater passages beneath the pool. The other 5 would practice rope techniques in preparation for Mexico's 2 deepest sinkholes, Sótano de las Golondrinas and Olla de las Guaguas. None of them could even imagine how they would get out of that hole. The group began preparations for the descent, but encountered an unexpected problem. There were no trees or rocks at the edge of the sinkhole to attach the ropes to. The group, divided by differing opinions, considered postponing or even canceling the plan, because the lack of a place to attach the rope would make the descent impossible and the adventure would end before it even began. The team members, who had no intention of giving up, finally decided to securely attach the rope to the tow hook of their SUV with 2 ropes. What they didn't know was that this decision would almost cost one person their life. At 10 a.m., Medina was the first to descend. The diving equipment hung below his waist and weighed him down. Due to this weight, Medina's descent began to accelerate uncontrollably. Medina managed to slow his descent by wrapping his legs around the rope to increase friction, but the force of the friction caused the synthetic rope to inflict severe pain on his leg. The rest of the team managed to descend one by one. Around 2 p.m., 5 divers prepared their diving equipment and began swimming to explore the deep waters. As they descended deeper, daylight gave way to darkness and a sharp cold. At 120 feet, they reached underwater cave passages, but they didn't know what awaited them, and they didn't have enough energy or courage today to enter the unexplored passages. They returned to the surface. The diving team gathered their equipment and clothing, preparing for the climb. The reason they didn't want to exhaust themselves underwater was that the climb would be much more tiring than the descent and dive. The steep limestone walls rising 285 feet were quite a grueling process, even for professional climbers. Medina, one of the most experienced members of the group, decided to climb last in order to safely bring the less experienced climbers up and check the equipment before the climb. Meanwhile, another experienced member of the group climbed first so that he could assist the less experienced climbers at critical points during the climb. By 3 p.m., 2 people had reached the summit. 4 people, 1 man and 3 women, continued to advance calmly on the ropes, the clatter of climbing equipment echoing throughout the cave. Medina had not yet started climbing and was immersed in the beauty of the view below. She was startled by a sudden horrified scream from above. When she looked up, her heart leapt out of her chest in horror at what she saw. One of the climbers had been using a limestone wall for support, but it had cracked, and a hive full of African honeybees had burst out of the crack, swarming the 4 people hanging on the rope. There were far more bees than in a normal hive. The 4 people hanging from the ropes were writhing in pain and screaming for help as they were stung hundreds of times, the pain becoming unbearable. Those waiting at the summit heard the screams and rushed to the bottom of the pit to see what was happening, but the bees saw them as a threat and began attacking them too. Seconds felt like hours, and the bee invasion became unbearable for the victims. Those at the top were far enough away to escape the bees, but those hanging from the rope were only a short distance from the hive, and the bees attacked in swarms, stinging every exposed area they found. Faced with this scene, Medina, horrified, realized she was panicking, took deep breaths to calm herself, and quickly began searching for a solution. Meanwhile, the group above lowered the third rope from the pit, and an experienced member of the group descended to rescue those hanging on the rope. Each descent meant being stung repeatedly, and each sting caused indescribable pain. He sped up and approached the nearest woman, attached her climbing harness to his own belt, took a knife in his hand, and cut the other rope binding the woman in agony. He pulled the woman up to the summit with double the load. He didn't wait. He descended again and pulled the second climber up in the same way. When he reached the top, he was covered in blisters and unbearable pain. His breathing was labored, his muscles were cramping, and his adrenaline was rapidly dropping. He managed to stagger to the car and called emergency services for help. Medina, who was 285 feet below, wasted no time putting on his diving suit. This suit would seriously protect him from bee attacks, but his hands and head were exposed, so those parts would not be protected. Meanwhile, one of the climbers hanging on the rope, about 80 feet above the ground, was still trying to scream in pain, while the other, 40 feet above him, was moving back and forth on the rope in pain from the attacks. As he moved, the bees saw this movement as a threat and became even more aggressive. As Medina began climbing upward, the adrenaline rush prevented him from reacting to the individual bee attacks. But as he ascended, the number and intensity of the attacks increased, subjecting his body to unbearable pain. Upon reaching the first climber, Medina, in agony, tied the climber's harness to his own, freeing him from the rope he was attached to, and attempted a controlled descent, which was far from easy. When they descended, the climber's entire body was covered in severe swelling, and toxins had accumulated in his body due to the constant stings. His entire body was convulsing, and he was on the verge of losing consciousness. Meanwhile, a member of the group above, in a panic, began reversing the vehicle to rescue the climber, doing something he shouldn't have done, and the ropes rubbing against the hard rocks on the descent section of the pit suffered serious wear. The danger for the suspended climber had doubled. Realizing the situation, Medina, knowing the climb would be risky, was forced to endure the horror of the scene before her, and she just stood there watching. The team next to Medina began to attend to the injured person next to them, whose condition was deteriorating and who was beginning to have constant seizures. He was no longer responding to anything. By 4:15 p.m., the rescue teams had arrived. A large team of 50 people surrounded the crater, but the bees saw them as a threat and began to attack. After hours of rescue efforts, the teams brought the stranded climber to the surface approximately 6 hours later. The patients were quickly taken to the hospital by ambulance, immediately underwent surgery, and were then placed in intensive care. The first climber rescued had been stung approximately 600 times and remained in intensive care for 3 days. The second climber rescued, who triggered the beehive, had been stung approximately 900 times and remained in intensive care for 2 weeks. The climber rescued by Medina and brought down to the ground was stung 400 times. Due to the severity of the stings and the effect of the venom, he lost consciousness and went into shock. Despite this, he remained in intensive care for 3 days and was then transferred to a regular room. The climber, who was left hanging on the rope and exposed to the bee attack for hours, remained in intensive care for 1 week, then was transferred to a normal room. But due to multiple stings, his organs could not withstand the venom and he was readmitted to intensive care. He had been stung approximately 1,200 times. All of the climbers left the hospital alive, and after this terrifying incident, they continued climbing to deeper and higher places, let alone passing by sinkholes. What do you think about these climbers? Imagine entering a room filled with flies on a hot summer day, and these flies, which cause nothing but disgust, begin to circle around your head, crawl into your clothes, and give you an unbearable feeling of suffocation. Now imagine if these were bees instead. Isn't that terrifying? You can share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if your friend started having a panic attack underwater and there were only 150 meters left to the exit? You can imagine divers feeling relieved and safer as they approach the surface. The danger of the deep, dark waters has been overcome, and as they ascend, the darkness fades away with the peace of seeing daylight. The water clears. Sunlight awaits you above. Cave divers call this moment seeing the light. The moment you feel the danger is over. The moment you relax. Pete Reagan saw that light. He was only 150 meters away, but those 150 meters are when some divers take their last breath. This story is about a man who lost everything just a few hundred meters from daylight, and a friend who fought to the last breath as the cave swallowed him. On February 16, 2002, experienced cave divers entered Little River Spring, one of North Florida's most beautiful and deceptive systems. Little River appears innocent, even serene from the surface. Crystal clear water, a gentle current, an inviting entrance. But once you step inside, the rules change. Tons of rock above you, side passages ready to surprise you ahead, a current pushing you back behind you. Among the group that day were 55-year-old Pete Reagan and 43-year-old Frank Murphy. The two knew each other, trusted each other. The dive followed a normal, safe plan. In the dome room, the group made a standard decision. They would end the dive and head for the exit. Everyone was relaxed. There was no risk. On the way out, Murphy and Reagan continued straight toward the entrance. Murphy in front, Reagan behind. A simple formation, common, safe. They were swimming against the current, moving toward daylight. No silt, no problems. No worries. Then Murphy felt a gnawing silence. He turned around. Reagan wasn't there. In that moment, he felt his heart stop. Reagan was motionless, drifting toward the bottom of the water, 12 meters behind Murphy. His body was convulsing, his muscles spasming violently. Reagan had suffered a serious neurological problem. 150 meters from the exit, his arms, legs, his entire body was spasming as if out of control, and Reagan was not responding. Murphy was facing one of the worst scenarios a diver could encounter. His heart was racing, his hands were starting to shake, and panic was taking over his entire body, causing him to lose control. However, he quickly realized he had to overcome the shock of what he had just experienced and help his friend. He swam back quickly, caught his friend, and placed the air regulator in his mouth. Performing this maneuver on someone having a seizure is quite difficult. The person's jaw muscles, along with all their other muscles, contract violently and can become impossible to move. Seeing that Reagan was still not breathing, Murphy used the purge valve to release the air from the oxygen tank, delivering oxygen directly to Reagan's lungs. At first, it seemed to work, and Reagan began to breathe, but after a short time, he stopped breathing again. Murphy continued to repeat this difficult and physically exhausting task over and over again, but to no avail. Murphy found himself in a situation that probably none of us would ever want to be in. His friend had gone into convulsions at a distance quite close to the surface, and his breathing kept stopping. Moreover, Murphy was now feeling physically and mentally exhausted. He had two options before him. The first was to leave Reagan and go up to the surface, then call for help to get Reagan out. However, Reagan would likely be dead by then, and Murphy did not want to leave him to die. The second option was to bring Reagan to the surface, which was not easy at all. He would have to swim against a strong current with twice the load. For Murphy, who was already exhausted, the chances of reek. What would you do? Would you turn back and risk your life to drag your friend along? Or would you surface and call for help? So what do you think Murphy did? Let's continue. Murphy, struggling to make a decision due to his physical and psychological state, didn't want to waste time thinking. With a sudden reflex, he grabbed Reagan by the arms and began swimming against the current. Reagan's breathing kept stopping, forcing Murphy to stop constantly and pump air into Reagan's lungs. While Reagan's lungs struggled to take in the air he was giving him, Murphy was fighting the current with the weight of his own size. During this time, Murphy's air tank was almost empty. They were close, painfully close. Only 100 meters remained to the surface. As Murphy pulled Reagan, his own breathing quickened, and he struggled to breathe. He was physically exhausted, cramps constantly shooting through his legs and arms, and his ascent slowed with every passing second. They were 12 meters from the surface, just 12 meters. Murphy's air tank was completely empty. Murphy could no longer breathe, and his mind was starting to cloud over. In a semi-conscious state, he reached for Reagan's air tank and took a deep breath. However, his oxygen was also running out, and he had to share it with Reagan. There were 3 meters left to the surface. However, Murphy continued, oxygen switching the air tank between himself and Reagan. But this breath was insufficient for his adrenaline-filled body. The divers above the water noticed something was wrong. Without wasting any time, they dove into the water, took Reagan from Murphy's hand, and brought them both to the surface. Murphy took a deep breath. Every breath he took seemed insufficient for his lungs. The salt water burned his throat, each breath intensifying the burning sensation. The divers rushed Reagan to the hospital immediately. However, Pete Reagan did not survive. Murphy, after resting in the hospital for a while, continued his life in good health, constantly feeling Reagan's pain deep within him. There is no mistake to examine here, no wrong turn, no bad decision, just a reminder of a truth known to cave divers but never accepted. You can do everything right and still lose. Medical incidents don't care about experience. They don't care how close you are to the exit. Caves don't forgive. Pete Reagan died in a place where thousands of divers have safely entered and exited. He died with a skilled friend right beside him. He died almost touching the daylight. That's what makes this story so unforgettable. If it can happen there, in clear water, so close to the light, with help so close, it can happen anywhere. Hitting the surface with the second option were quite low.
Today, we will examine two of the most tragic stories in cave history. The first, he burned alive, his skin melting and hanging down, and his only escape was to climb hundreds of meters. The second, a 100-kilogram man was stuck upside down, his head injured, and his brain filling with blood by the minute. Welcome to Cave Tragedies.
Sistema Huautla, January 1988. The smell of burnt human flesh permeated every corner of the cave, and everyone was breathing in this smell as they tried to rescue their friends. Bill Steele, his body burned and hanging by pieces of flesh. Would he be able to emerge from the depths of the cave? January 10th, 1988. A documentary crew descended into the depths of Sistema Huautla, one of Mexico's deepest caves, for a 9-day underground exploration trip. Sistema Huautla is one of the deepest and most dangerous cave systems in the Western Hemisphere. Even if you descend into the depths of the cave and start your return journey without resting, your trip could take days. The team descended from the Sótano de San Agustín entrance and set up a 9-day underground camp in the depths of the cave, in a massive chamber called the Salón de la Sierra Mazateca. After days of rope climbing, narrow passages, and vertical descents, they reached their destination, Salón de la Sierra Mazateca. They set out to explore different depths of the cave to begin filming the documentary. Everything was going according to plan, until that night. Meals were prepared in turn at the camp. On the 7th day, it was Bill Steele's turn to prepare dinner. Bill was a 34-year-old experienced cave explorer. He was going to light the MSR Whisper Light Camp stove and cook dinner for the team. He pumped the stove's fuel reservoir. He checked the pressure. He struck the lighter. Sparks from the lighter began dancing around the cave in an incredible way. A small fireball appeared before Bill's eyes. It grew. It expanded. In a fraction of a second, it turned into a huge ball of flame. Before Bill could understand what was happening, he felt incredible pain in his body. His body went into shock from this sudden and unbearable pain. His nerve endings were burning, but his brain couldn't process so much pain. There had been a leak in the tube Bill was using, and the cave was filled with an odorless and highly flammable mixture of gasoline and gas. The gasoline inside the tube had spread throughout the area, trapping Bill in the middle of the flames. The moment the splashing gasoline hit his body, Bill turned into a torch. The flames, starting at his feet and arms, engulfed his entire body, and Bill instinctively began to run. But the more he ran, the bigger the flames grew. The pain intensified. Hearing the noise, the team members rushed to the campsite. What they saw would remain etched in their minds for the rest of their lives. Flames engulfed everything. Equipment was burning. Tents were melting. The dark cave room had turned into an orange hell. And right in the middle of that hell, Bill. He was burning like a human torch. Flames rose from his back, his arms flailed in the fire, and the screams coming from his mouth no longer sounded human. They were animalistic, a sound that tore at your soul. Finally, 2 people pinned him to the ground. They pressed his face into the cave mud. With wet bags and bare hands, they tried to smother every inch of the flames. After their desperate attempts, the fire went out. But Bill was in terrible shape. His back was covered in 2nd and 3rd degree burns. The skin was charred, blackened in places. His right hand was unrecognizable. Pieces of skin hung from his palm, revealing raw muscle tissue beneath. They wanted to get Bill out, but how? They were hours away from the surface. Ahead of them lay hundreds of meters of vertical rope climbing, narrow passages, flooded sections, and Bill's right hand was unusable. Stop and imagine. Hundreds of meters below the surface, gasoline splashes on you, and you are burning in flames. Serious burns form on your body until they are extinguished. Your right arm is completely burned, unusable. Your hand is torn apart by the intensity of the fire. The skin is hanging off, and many parts of your body have turned black. And your only way out involves hours of climbing and crawling. No helicopter or ambulance can come and get you. Can you imagine how Bill felt? Bill writhed in agony, and the smell of burnt flesh filled the cave. Every breath the team took brought this smell with it, making the situation even more terrifying. Two members of the team, Loss and Daniel, volunteered to accompany him. The climb began. The first obstacle was the gorge just above the camp, normally an easy crossing, but surface rains had swollen the underground stream. Instead of knee-deep water, there was now a current powerful enough to sweep a person away. Bill Steele tried to hold onto the wall with one hand. Each time his burned hand touched the rocks, the pain exploded in his brain like a white flash. He screamed but didn't stop. After half an hour of torture, they crossed the current. Then the rope climbing began. 77 meters. Bill clung to the rope with one hand, pushing himself up with his legs, his burned back rubbing against the harness straps with every movement. He stopped halfway, hung on the rope, trying to breathe. Tears streamed from his eyes, from pain, from helplessness. It was unclear. They tried to pull Bill up by tying a rope to him, but with every pressure the rope exerted on his body, Bill writhed in incredible pain. They had to untie the rope. Bill gritted his teeth and kept climbing. 110 meters, then 80 meters, then 60 meters. With each climb, he slowed down a little more. Each movement became a little harder. Bill wasn't talking anymore. He was just climbing, like a machine. The pain was now just background noise, so intense that his brain had stopped processing it. 8 hours had passed. The final obstacle lay ahead, a 200-meter vertical climb, the last gateway to the surface. Bill looked at the rope. Above, far away, a faint light was visible. Daylight. "We're almost there," said Daniel. "One last climb." Bill nodded. He had no energy left to speak. He began to climb. The first 50 meters went well, or at least as badly as before. But then something changed. Bill's movement slowed. He paused. His grip on the rope loosened. Bill's head fell forward. His body went limp. Only the harness straps held him, motionless and suspended on the rope. Loss began climbing in a panic. Daniel was coming up behind. When they reached Steele, his eyes were half open, but he saw no one. His lips were blue. He was breathing, but barely, shallowly, irregularly.
Bill, stay with me.
Bill's lips moved. He tried to whisper something. Loss put his ear close.
I'm tired.
Those were Bill Steele's last words. Loss checked Steele's pulse. There was nothing. Bill Steele had died, hanging from the rope, 150 meters from the surface. Loss and Daniel had to leave their friend's body on the rope. They didn't have the strength to carry him. They climbed to the surface and called for help. The rescue team retrieved Steele's body hours later. Bill Steele was 34 years old. He was an experienced caver. He had survived hundreds of dangerous situations. He climbed for 8 hours in hellish pain. He passed hundreds of meters of vertical shaft with one hand. His back burned. He never complained. He never gave up. But at some point, the body gives up. And that point came just meters from daylight. Bill Steele fought. He fought until his last breath. But Sistema Huatla didn't let him go. He was hanging upside down, his arms tightly bound to his body, gravity filling his brain with blood with every passing minute. People were around him, but none could get him out. He couldn't scream because even breathing was torture. Rocks were falling on his face, and he couldn't even lift his hand to protect himself. Bill Coughlin, weighing 100 kilograms, remained in this position for 7 hours, and no one could rescue him. 24 hours earlier, Bill, Kevin, and Jim, 3 friends, had come from Chicago to Kentucky for Memorial Day. They arrived at Buzzard's Roost on Sunday, May 30th. There were 2 tours of the cave, one easy, the other a challenging tour full of narrow passages and climbs, recommended only for professionals. After completing the standard tour, Bill and Jim signed up for the second tour, but Kevin felt uneasy. The narrow entrance had unsettled him. He told his friends he would wait there. Bill and Jim wanted to insist, but seeing the worry on Kevin's face, they gave up. They waved goodbye and followed their guide, Dave Harden, into the darkness. What Kevin didn't know was that only one of his 2 friends would survive. Bill struggled from the very first step. At 1.80 meters tall and weighing over 100 kilograms, his body wasn't suited for this cave. His shoulders scraped against the rocks and his breath caught in the narrow tunnels. But he kept going. If he couldn't fit, The guide wouldn't have brought him here, right? They reached the most challenging part of the route, a V-shaped crack in the ground. They would descend, slide down the flat section on their backs, and climb out the other side. Bill took a deep breath. The damp smell of the cave left a slight burning sensation in his lungs, but helped him relax a little, and he dove head first into the hole. He was squeezed from all sides. He bent his shoulders and hips. He raised his arms and made his body as thin as possible. When he emerged on the other side, he relaxed. He had made it through the difficult part. Narrow passages, vertical descents, rotten rope ladders. The group advanced into the depths of the cave for 3 hours. At one point, they encountered a 15-meter pit. The descent route was an old rope ladder with cracked steps and wobbly planks. They managed to descend with careful steps. Finally, they reached the last stop, the large chamber. Everyone was tired but happy. They had succeeded. Meanwhile, Guide Dave made a strange decision. He said that since the tour was running late, he needed to go up to the surface to make a phone call. And he left. 6 novice cavers were left without a guide at the deepest point of the cave. After waiting for the tour guide for about 35-40 minutes, the group began to get bored and decided to turn back. When Bill looked at the rope ladder in the large chamber, he felt something had changed inside him. Going down had been difficult, but climbing back up was something else entirely, especially at his weight. On his first attempt, he climbed a few steps. Then he stopped. His arms were shaking. He went back down. On his second attempt, he made a little more progress. He reached the rock ledge but went back down again. Third attempt. Bill's stress level had risen considerably, and he felt as if panic had taken hold of his entire body. For a moment, he thought that cave would be his grave. Just then, Jim stepped in.
Come on, Bill. Try one more time.
He said, bringing Bill back to his senses. Seeing his friend's anxious expression below, Jim also began to feel uneasy, but he didn't show it to Bill. Bill took another deep breath. This time the dampness didn't burn his throat, but breathing didn't calm him. Bill gripped the rope tightly and began climbing the steps one by one. 1, 2, 3, until he reached the last step. All he had to do now was grab the rock a little further away and climb up. However, the rock, damp from the cave's humidity, had become even more slippery from the sweat of those who had climbed before him. As Bill reached for the rock, he heard a crack under his foot. The already cracked step couldn't bear Bill's weight and broke. Jim watched his friend fall and, panicking, ran down. Bill was lying on the ground, bleeding from his head. This was not good. A wounded man at the deepest point of the cave, hours away from the exit. When Guide Dave returned, he examined Bill. He made a risky decision. Bill could climb on his own. They began pulling him up, securing him with ropes. It was slow and laborious work, but they were making progress. First one ladder, then the second ladder. Bill was tired and dazed, but they were getting closer to the exit. Then they came to the V-shaped crevice. Bill looked into the hole. It had been difficult to descend. Now he had to do the same thing. With a head injury, hours of exhaustion, and arms that had started to shake. And this time, there would be no help like there had been on the stairs. Bill tried to take a deep breath, but it caught in his throat. He moved toward the crevice and, following Dave's instructions, lowered his body into the hole head first. Bill slowly lowered himself, gripping the rock steps in front of him. He passed the first ledge, then the second. Then his arms began to go numb. Injury, exhaustion, cold. His body was no longer obeying his commands. He was sliding down uncontrollably. As he tried to hold on, his arms were pinned against his body. One arm was pressed against his stomach. The other was pinned against the sharp rocks behind him. And he stopped at the narrowest point, upside down. His arms locked. Bill tried to move. He couldn't budge an inch. He did the only thing he could do. He screamed. He screamed helplessly, hopelessly. Jim ran from the other side. He could see Bill's head, but only his head. He couldn't pull him. His neck could break. Dave tried pushing from behind, but nothing happened. Minutes passed. Every attempt made the situation worse. By 10:30 p.m., Bill had been upside down for 3 hours. He was exhausted, and the blood pressure to his brain was increasing. His stomach and intestines pressing against his lungs. This made every breath unbearable. Dave and Troy were faced with a different reality. Bill's body was blocking the only exit. They were trapped too. The Cave City Volunteer Fire Department arrived at the cave after midnight. They were stunned by what they saw. A 100-pound man was stuck in a narrow hole, hanging upside down for hours. Inside, pressure from his stomach and intestines was compressing his lungs, making it harder to breathe with every passing minute. Furthermore, he was beginning to suffer from hypothermia, and his blood had pooled in his head from hanging upside down for hours. This exacerbated the bleeding in his head. It was impossible to get him out. His arms were so tightly pinned that they they realized the only solution was to break the rocks in front of him. The rescue team began breaking the rocks. Only one person could work in the narrow space. Stretching at an awkward angle, they broke the rocks next to Bill's head. Bill couldn't bring his hands to his face because of the falling rock fragments and dust. He could only close his eyes. The wound on his head was covered in dust and, due to the moisture, was slowly becoming infected. At 4 a.m., Bill lost consciousness. His pulse was still beating, but he was no longer responding. At 5 a.m., Bill Coughlin was pronounced dead. He had been trapped upside down for 7 hours. Jim was in shock. A few hours earlier, he had entered the cave with his friend. Now he was standing next to his body. For the next 8 hours, they worked to remove the body and rescue Dave and Troy from the other side. The methods they used were never disclosed. The coroner's report simply stated, the methods used could not be applied to a living person. Kevin, meanwhile, had been waiting above ground the entire time. That instinct, the feeling that pulled him away from the tour, had saved his life. Bill remained stuck upside down for 7 hours. There were people around him. He could hear their voices, but no one could rescue him. Sometimes a voice inside you says, don't do it. Listen to that voice, because some caves have no return. Today, we will examine two of the most dangerous stories in history. First, a man who was blinded by flames engulfing his head hundreds of meters below the surface. The most dangerous stories made an extraordinary effort to bring him back to the surface. Some caves have no return. An inexperienced explorer who ignored his friend's warnings not to enter a passageway. We will examine two of the most dangerous stories in history. Had to completely strip him to rescue him. Welcome to Cave Tragedies. March 19, 1983, West Virginia. 3 cave explorers set out to explore a cave system in West Virginia. The cave presented a challenging environment requiring serious technical skills for exploration. Reaching the entrance required a series of vertical descents and climbs, and the cave extended deep underground through corridors formed by narrow passages created by collapsed rock piles that formed narrow gaps between massive boulders. A challenging environment. Kent Sievers was 30 years old. He was accompanied by 2 close friends, David and Michael. The 3 had been exploring caves together for years. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses. They trusted each other. That trust would save Kent's life a few hours later. On this special spring day, the 3 experienced cave explorers entered the depths of the cave. They all used carbide lamps for lighting. These lamps work by dripping water onto calcium carbide pellets, producing acetylene gas that burns with a bright, steady flame. Carbide lamps had been standard for cave explorers for decades. They were reliable and provided good light. However, they also produced acetylene gas, which is extremely flammable and explosive when mixed with air in the right proportions. The trio spent 10 hours underground. It was an exhausting but rewarding day. They had seen magnificent formations, taken photos, and laughed together. When they decided to ascend, they had a significant journey ahead of them to reach the surface. Halfway up, the group took a break and began refilling their carbide lamps. After 10 hours of burning, the lamps were running low on fuel. Kent Sievers opened his bag to get to the calcium carbide stock. The bag was made of ballistic nylon. What Kent didn't realize was that this material had essentially become gas-tight. The calcium carbide pellets he was carrying had become damp due to the humidity in the cave atmosphere, and the wet pellets had started to produce acetylene gas. Over the course of 10 hours, a significant amount of acetylene had accumulated inside the bag, and the bag's tight weave had trapped the gas inside, creating a bomb ready to explode. Kent held the dim light of his carbide lamp in one hand while opening the zipper of the bag with the other. At that moment, the gas that had accumulated in the bag began to mix rapidly with the air. The gas ignited as soon as it reached the flame. In an instant, the cave was lit up by a ball of yellow flame. Imagine, 1 second everything is normal. The next second your face is engulfed in a ball of flame. Imagine the pain, the shock, the fear. David and Michael helplessly watched their best friend's face burn. Those few seconds left indelible marks on all 3 of their lives. When the flames dispersed, Kent was still standing, but something was very wrong. He opened his eyes, closed them, then squeezed them shut and waited a moment, then opened them again. Nothing had changed. Everything was dark. Absolute darkness. No light from carbide lamps, no shadows, no shapes, nothing. Kent couldn't see anything. At that moment, Kent's world collapsed. He brought his hands to his face, touched his eyes, as if touching them would bring back his sight. His breathing quickened. He panicked. He tried to speak, but only muffled sounds came out. In his 30 years of life, he had never felt so helpless. David and Michael stared in shock at the scene before them. Before their eyes, the gas from the bag had formed a fireball and exploded on Kent's face. Kent's face was burned, his eyebrow and the front of his hair gone in the fire. Although horrified, they knew that panicking in such a situation, especially since they were hours away from the surface, would put Kent in even greater danger. Both had encountered such situations before and knew how to react. David held Kent tightly by the shoulders. Michael approached. They both held him. They began to talk to him. Their voices trembled, but they tried to appear calm. After minutes that felt like hours, Kent's panicked breathing slowly calmed down. Finally, Kent was able to speak in a fearful voice. He asked what had happened, but he already knew. He asked if his eyes were damaged. David and Michael examined Kent's face in the light of their carbide lamps. His eyebrows were burned, and there were burn marks on his face, but his eyes looked fine. There was no obvious damage. Hearing this, Kent felt a little relieved. His blindness might be temporary, and perhaps his sight could return. Michael and David began to think, should they wait for help and call the rescue team, or should they get Kent out themselves? Getting him out of the cave themselves carried irreversible risks. Kent was blind, and the slightest wrong move could lead to his death. However, waiting for help was even riskier. The cave was cold, and Kent was at risk of hypothermia. The injury to his eye required urgent medical attention, and every passing hour increased the risk of permanent blindness. David and Michael faced a challenging journey ahead. A path filled with obstacles lay before them. Michael would lead the way, telling Kent what to do at every step, where to place his hands, where to step, when to pull. David would stay behind, ready to help if Kent fell or got stuck. They began their return journey. The first climb was 30 meters. Michael began climbing, searching for deep crevices and solid protrusions to make Kent's climb easier. Kent followed him, trying to find the indentations and protrusions with his hands and feet, following Michael's commands and moving slowly. David followed right behind Kent, ready to catch him if his friend lost his balance. The first 5 meters passed relatively smoothly. Michael gave instructions from above. Kent searched for handholds by feeling with his hands, and David waited behind, ready to provide support. However, at the 6th meter, things got complicated. Michael told Kent to reach his right hand up toward a ledge about 30 centimeters to the right. Kent reached out. His fingers wandered through the air, touched the rock, but couldn't find the ledge. The disorientation from being blind had completely disrupted his distance perception. Michael noticed and changed his position. Securing himself with one hand, he reached down with the other, grasped Kent's wrist, and guided his hand directly onto the ledge. Kent gripped tightly with relief, but this solution created a new problem. Michael had to guide Kent while hanging by one arm. His arms began to tremble. Muscle fatigue was building rapidly. At the 12th meter, the critical moment came. Kent's left foot slipped from its ledge. His body swung backward. That momentary falling sensation was pure terror for someone who couldn't see. Kent squeezed with all his strength to keep his hands from separating from the rock. David reacted instantly. He grabbed Kent's backpack and pushed him toward the wall. Kent's chest hit the rock. It hurt, but he didn't fall. For a few seconds, all three remained motionless, only heavy breathing echoing in the cave. Michael looked down and asked if Kent was okay. Kent's voice came out cracked, but he said he could continue. They climbed the remaining 18 meters this way. Michael scouted ahead. Kent followed blindly. David served as a safety net behind. At the 20th meter, Michael found a platform and pulled Kent up. The first climb was over, but there were still 5 more climbs ahead, each potentially just as dangerous as the first. For Kent, every step was a leap of faith. He couldn't see the footholds he reached or the void beneath him. He relied solely on his friends' voices. Imagine climbing in complete darkness, hundreds of meters below the surface, unable to see where you're gripping, stepping, or climbing, relying solely on someone's voice. How terrifying would that be? When they reached the narrow passages, things became much more difficult. In these sections, Kent moved forward by touching Michael's foot. Wherever Michael's foot went, Kent went too, step by step, inch by inch. Consider Michael's situation. His friend's life was literally in his hands. Every word, every instruction was crucial. One mistake could cause Kent to fall or get stuck. The responsibility must have been overwhelming, but Michael didn't give up. He remained calm. He continued to guide him. David carried the same burden. Behind them, he watched Kent's every move, ready to catch him if he fell, to help him if he got stuck. Hours passed. What would normally take 2 hours to climb out took 8 grueling hours. And finally, light. David and Michael almost cried when they saw the cave entrance. Kent couldn't see, but he could hear the relief in his friends' voices. By the time they got out, it was night. Kent stood under stars he couldn't see. He felt the night wind on his face. He was alive. He was alive thanks to his friends. Kent was rushed to the hospital. Doctors treated the burns on his face, but the real problem was his eyes. After a series of examinations, they said the blindness was temporary. 2 weeks later, Kent's vision returned to normal. There was no permanent damage. It was a miraculous recovery. November 6th, 2015. In late November, a group of 4 friends entered Blackwater Cave, a little-known branch of the Mammoth Cave system in Kentucky. The cave was famous among local cave explorers for both its beauty and its dangerous narrow passages. Marcus, Tyler, Sarah, and Jake had set aside a weekend to explore the cave. Marcus was the most experienced member of the group. With over 10 years of caving experience, he had successfully completed many challenging climbs. Tyler, Sarah, and Jake had been inspired by him and had started their caving adventures a few years earlier. Tyler and Sarah moved quickly. They were cautious and calm during climbs. Jake, however, was a bit different. With his hyperactive personality, Jake was the fun-loving kid of the group, but he carried this playful attitude into the cave and often got himself into trouble. They began exploring the cave. The first few hours went smoothly. Marcus was following the map he had prepared in advance. Then they came across an unmarked side passage on the map. The entrance to the passage was narrow but inviting. A slight breeze was coming from inside. If there was a breeze, it meant there was a large space at the other end of the tunnel. Marcus shook his head and told the group that this passage wasn't on the map and that they shouldn't go through it. Sarah agreed, but Jake couldn't take his eyes off the passage. What if there was something inside that no one had seen? Seeing the look on Jake's face, Marcus firmly stated that entering a passage they knew nothing about was dangerous, but Jake didn't seem satisfied. He would just look a few meters inside. He was sure he wouldn't get stuck. He was thin. He could fit through the passage. At least that's what Jake thought. In reality, he had an average build and was not ideal for this passage. Jake was quite excited to see the other side of the tunnel. Even though the others didn't want to, they were curious too. The group members agreed that Jake would turn back if he felt danger and allowed him to enter the tunnel. The first few meters of the passage were relatively easy. Jake crawled forward. He could hear his friends behind him. When Marcus asked from behind about the condition of the tunnel, Jake said there was no problem and crawled forward a few more meters. The passage began to narrow. Then its shape suddenly changed. In front of him was a passage shaped like an inverted V. 2 rock walls met at an angle above, narrowing below until they were almost closed. His legs would be squeezed in the narrow lower part, while his torso would remain in the wider upper part. What's more, that wasn't all. The ground he would have to crawl on to get to the other side was covered with sharp pointed rocks. This greatly increased the likelihood of his clothes getting caught in the already narrow tunnel. What would you do in this situation? Would you consider continuing? So, what do you think Jake did? For a moment, he looked at the passage ahead and thought about turning back. However, an uncontrollable urge inside him compelled him to see the other side of the tunnel. Hesitantly, Jake thought, if I get stuck, I'll turn back, and continued crawling. Jake stretched his arms out in front of him and began to enter the V-shaped passageway, head first. The first few centimeters were easy. Then his body entered the narrow space. He was stuck on one side, but on the other side he tried to continue, thinking, "You're almost there, Jake." Then he stopped. He couldn't move another inch. He realized he was stuck and wanted to turn back, but there was a problem. The moment he started to retreat, his clothes began to gather around his head like they were caught in barbed wire. Feeling his clothes pressing against his throat, Jake felt like he was suffocating. His breathing quickened and his panic grew. He tried to turn back again, but this time, as his clothes wrapped around his neck and waist and began to pull his body down, Jake started coughing. Meanwhile, Tyler, waiting at the tunnel entrance, called out to Jake. The only sound he heard was a muffled voice. It didn't take long for them to realize Jake was stuck. After a moment's thought, Marcus decided to enter the tunnel. The scene he saw was not pleasant. Jake was seriously stuck, and his clothes were preventing him from getting out. The solution was simple: remove Jake's clothes. Marcus was angry at Jake for getting himself into this situation, but there seemed to be no other solution. Even if Tyler and Sarah reached Jake, they couldn't get to him. Marcus turned back, removed all equipment that could get caught on the protruding rocks, took a sharp knife just in case, and began crawling toward where Jake was. Meanwhile, Jake was struggling to breathe, trapped in a very narrow space. His body was sweating, and his sweat-soaked clothes were starting to lower his body temperature. Marcus reached Jake and began cursing as he started to strip him. He took off his shoes and reached for his belt. However, the buckle was stuck and wouldn't come off. After struggling for a while, Marcus decided to cut the belt. He slowly brought the knife towards Jake's waist. It was quite difficult to cut because the belt was stuck against the walls, but after struggling a bit, he managed to cut the belt. He had managed to remove the stuck clothing. Now the situation was even more critical. He had to reach Jake's waist and remove the clothing that was strangling his throat. Jake's clothes were stuck to his body. The jacket's zipper was right where his chest was stuck. Marcus's fingers had to squeeze into the millimeter-wide gap between Jake's body and the rock. Jake groaned in pain and told Marcus to stop. He couldn't breathe. Marcus realized that while trying to reach Jake, he might have pushed him further in. He had to find another way. Marcus told Jake he was going to cut his clothes. Jake couldn't respond anymore. He just gave a raspy breath of approval. Marcus started working with the knife. He started at the back of the jacket. The knife was small and his range of motion was extremely limited. He had to bend his wrist into impossible positions just to hold the knife at the right angle. The knife slipped a few times and cut his own finger. Blood began to flow, but he didn't care. The back of the jacket was torn inch by inch. Finally, Marcus separated the fabric from the rocks. Jake breathed lightly. For the first time in minutes, his chest could expand a little. Marcus got to work. He was also in a confined space. He couldn't fully extend his arms. As his fingers reached through the rocks to Jake's clothes, the sharp stones of the tunnel cut his knuckles. After a long and difficult effort, Marcus managed to remove Jake's clothes. Now Jake was left in just his underwear. The clothes were no longer rubbing against the rocks. He had a chance to move. Marcus grabbed Jake's ankles and began to pull him slowly. The first few centimeters were the hardest. As Jake's body emerged from the V-shaped passage, the rock surfaces scraped his skin. 1 centimeter, 2 centimeters, 5 centimeters, 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters. Then Jake's body suddenly relaxed. He had passed the narrowest point of the V. Marcus kept pulling. Jake's body slid out of the passage. When Jake emerged into the wider part of the passage, Marcus laid him on his back. His body was covered in scratches and scrapes from head to toe. A dark bruise had formed on his stomach, but he was breathing. He was alive. Half an hour later, Jake had recovered enough to walk. The group began to turn back. By the time they emerged from the cave, night had fallen. Jake stopped at the cave entrance and looked back at that dark hole that had nearly swallowed him, that underground world. That night, Jake learned something. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the cave itself. Sometimes the greatest danger is one's own blind courage. He hadn't listened to his friends. He had ignored their warnings, and he had nearly paid for it with his life.
Today I will tell you 2 cave stories that ended horribly. In the first story, a man fell from a height of 1,000 meters, broke his spine, and was left alone in the dark for 7 days. In the second story, a diver got stuck upside down underwater and waited for 6 hours for his oxygen to run out. Both faced impossible situations. Which one survived? Both? Neither. We leave it to the audience's judgment. Welcome to Cave Tragedies. He had been lost underground for 7 days, away from daylight, without food, water, or light. All around him was darkness, silence, and the echo of his own screams. When they found him, he was on the verge of losing his mind. The date was June 12, 2014. Johann Westhauser, a 52-year-old German cave explorer, descended into the Riesending cave in southern Germany with his friends. It was one of Europe's deepest caves, kilometers of tunnels, a depth of 1,100 meters, labyrinthine passages. The team was experienced. Everyone was skilled. However, the deeper they went, the greater the danger became. The first fatal mistake was underestimating this risk. The team had been exploring the depths of the cave for days. On the morning of June 12th, they reached a narrow passage at a depth of 1,000 meters. Johann prepared to jump to the other side of the passage. It was a normal movement he had done dozens of times. He planted his feet firmly on the ground and jumped. But this time, his foot slipped. His body lost its balance, and he fell onto the hard rocks 3 meters below. A terrible cracking sound echoed. Johann's scream filled the cave. His back had hit the rocks. The pain was unbearable. He was writhing on the ground, unable to breathe. The team rushed to his side. Johann was in very bad shape. His back was broken. He had a deep wound on his head, and he was bleeding. He could also have internal bleeding.
Panic set in. They were 1,000 meters deep, a full kilometer below ground. The nearest exit was kilometers of tunnel and hours away. Johann couldn't move. Every movement caused him pain. His spine might have been seriously damaged. Carrying him could paralyze him, but leaving him there meant certain death. The team made a difficult decision. One person would go up and call for emergency help. The others would stay with Johann, keep him warm, comfort him, and keep him alive. The cave had taken them prisoner. It was dark, cold, and unforgiving, and it would be days before help arrived. On the surface, the alarm was raised. Germany's largest cave rescue operation began. 1,000 volunteers, experts from 12 countries, doctors, mountaineers, cave rescue teams. But Johann was 1,000 meters deep. Getting him out could take a week. Inside the cave, Johann was fighting for his life. He had fractures in his back. The slightest wrong movement could sever his spinal cord, leaving him completely paralyzed. The wound on his head continued to bleed. Hypothermia had set in. The cave's temperature was only 5 degrees Celsius. The team wrapped him in blankets and brought small heaters, but it wasn't enough. Johann began to shiver. Johann was racing against time and death. On the second day, the first professional rescue team reached Johann. The doctors brought medical supplies and stretchers. However, a specially made stretcher was needed to transport Johann safely. It had to be sturdy enough to fit through narrow tunnels and protect his broken spine. Lowering this stretcher 1,000 meters down would take hours. On the third day, the special stretcher finally arrived. The doctors placed Johann on the stretcher extremely slowly and carefully. Every movement was painful for Johann. Then began one of the most challenging rescue journeys in history. Climbing 1,000 meters back up. Narrow tunnels, steep slopes, water-dripping passages. Each was an obstacle to overcome. Constantly rotating teams were needed to carry the stretcher. Every 50 meters, a fresh team replaced the exhausted one. On the fourth day, Johann's condition deteriorated dangerously. His pulse weakened. His consciousness became clouded. The risk of internal bleeding was increasing. The doctors intervened urgently. IV fluids, medication, oxygen tanks. But the cave wasn't letting him go easily. The tunnels seemed endless. On the fifth day, Johann had been halfway up the 500-meter descent in the hands of the teams. However, he still had 500 meters to go to reach the surface. Could his body withstand this stress? The rescue teams were exhausted and hopeless. Every passing hour reduced Johann's chances of survival. Johann was injured at a depth of 1,000 meters and was brought up over 5 days. Do you think his body could withstand this horrific stress? Or did the cave claim him forever? Share your predictions in the comments, because the outcome of this story will go down in rescue history books. On the 6th day, Johann was approaching the surface with only the last 100 meters remaining. But the hardest part was just beginning. The final tunnel was almost vertical, a slippery slope with water constantly dripping down. The team gathered their last reserves of strength. They pulled the stretcher with ropes, lifting it centimeter by centimeter. Johann was semi-conscious, but still breathing. June 19th, 2014, 11:45 p.m. Exactly 7 days later, Johann Westhauser was pulled from the cave. The ambulance helicopter was waiting. Doctors intervened immediately. His spine was broken. He had severe head trauma, and he was suffering from severe hypothermia. But he was alive. 1,000 people, 7 days, 1,000 meters deep. One of the greatest cave rescue operations in history had been successfully completed. Johann was taken to the hospital. He underwent surgery to repair his spine. His spine was stabilized with steel plates. Months of intensive physical therapy began. Slowly, he learned to walk again. It was a true miracle. Doctors couldn't fully explain how he survived for so long under those conditions at a depth of 1,000 meters. The cold, the trauma, the stress, each could have been fatal on its own. But Johann endured. The lesson of the story: depth changes everything. An accident at a depth of 1,000 meters is completely different from one on the surface. Rescue efforts take days. Every minute is spent on the thin line between life and death. Johan's mistake was underestimating the risk. A fall of just 3 meters nearly cost him his life. But this tragedy also showed the power of human solidarity. 1,000 people from 12 different countries came together for one man. Volunteers risked their own lives, diving into narrow tunnels, passing through water passages, going without sleep for days, just to save one life. After Johan recovered, he returned to caving, but he was now more careful, more humble. Caves don't forgive, he said. One mistake meant death, but when humanity comes together, it can perform miracles. The Riesending cave still stood there, 1,100 meters deep, dark, desolate, and silent. The spot where Johan had fallen was marked as a warning for future generations. The cave had nearly killed him, but 1,000 people brought him back. Tragedy turned into heroism. For 6 hours, he was trapped upside down, underwater, in dark tunnels. The laws of physics made this impossible, but he survived. On November 8, 2010, 32-year-old Eric Establi was diving alone at the Fontaine de Vaucluse spring in southern France. This was one of the world's deepest underground water sources, with unexplored tunnels and unknown depths. Eric was an experienced cave diver, but diving alone that day would prove to be a fatal mistake. Fontaine de Vaucluse was an enchanting place, with crystal clear waters gushing from mysterious depths, but beneath the surface lay a deadly labyrinth of narrow tunnels and passages that suddenly plunged deep. Eric had dived early in the morning. His equipment was flawless: 2 oxygen tanks, a powerful flashlight, a spare regulator. Everything was under control. He descended to a depth of 50 meters, then entered a narrow tunnel. The tunnel curved downward along a dark passage. Eric pressed on. Then disaster struck. The flashlight's cord caught on a rock protrusion. As he tried to pull back, the regulator's cord got caught between the rocks. He reflexively turned, but as he moved, his foot caught on another rock. His body twisted. The current dragged him upside down and pinned him. He was hanging upside down, feet up, suspended beneath the water. The narrow tunnel prevented him from moving. He panicked. He tried to pull himself back and escape, but it was impossible. The tunnel had trapped him, and he was alone. No one knew where Eric was. The water was silently surrounding him. The oxygen tank was still working, but how long would it last? The cave was slowly preparing to suffocate him. Eric was hanging upside down, his body squeezed into the narrow tunnel. Gravity was pumping blood to his head. His ears were ringing. He felt pressure in his eyes. Breathing was difficult. The regulator was working, but his position was crushing his lungs. First hour. He struggled for minutes. He tried to free his feet, but the rock held him tight. He tried to twist his body around. The tunnel wouldn't allow it. Every movement squeezed him tighter. Then he accepted the terrible truth. He couldn't get out on his own. Second hour. Panic gave way to calm. He remembered meditation techniques, slowed his breathing, calmed his heart. He had to conserve oxygen. He remained motionless, taking only regular breaths, but the cold was beginning to seep into his body. The water temperature was 13 degrees Celsius. Hypothermia was slowly approaching. Third hour. As the hours passed, his mind began to cloud over. He could no longer distinguish reality from fantasy. He began to see visions. His family, his children. Would he never see them again? He looked at the gauge on the oxygen tank. It was half full. Maybe 2 more hours? Then what would happen? Outside, no one knew Eric was missing. His wife grew concerned when he didn't come home that evening. She called the police. They found his car in Fontaine de Vaucluse, his diving equipment missing. They understood Eric was underwater. At midnight, rescue divers arrived, but diving into the dangerous tunnels in the dark was like suicide. They would have to wait until morning. 6th hour. Eric's consciousness was fading. The cold and lack of oxygen was slowing his brain. The regulator was still working, But how much longer could he hang suspended underwater at a depth of 50 meters? Physics said it was impossible. The human body couldn't survive upside down underwater for that long. Eric should have died, but he was still breathing. When morning came, would the rescue divers find him, or would they only find his body? Share your thoughts in the comments, because what happened will astonish the medical world. In the morning, rescue divers entered the water. They searched the depths of Fontaine de Vaucluse. At 9 a.m., they found Eric hanging motionless in the narrow tunnel. They thought he was dead. They approached him. Then they saw that air bubbles were still coming out of his regulator. He was breathing. 6 hours. The human body cannot survive in this position for that long. Blood pressure should have damaged his brain, and lack of oxygen should have led to death. But Eric was alive. Rescue efforts began immediately. It took half an hour to free Eric's foot from the rock. They slowly pulled him up. When they brought him to the surface, Eric was unconscious, but his heart was beating. They took him to the hospital by ambulance. The doctors were shocked. Severe hypothermia, risk of brain edema, water in his lungs. But he was alive. Eric spent a week in intensive care. He slowly recovered. Doctors described his survival as a miracle. They couldn't fully explain why he didn't die. They had a few theories. The cold water may have slowed his metabolism, preventing brain damage. Meditation may have lowered his heart rate, conserving oxygen. And maybe, just maybe, a little luck. The lesson of the story: diving alone is deadly, even for the most experienced divers. Eric's mistake was simple. He didn't tell anyone, and he didn't have a backup diver. When an accident happened, no one could help him. He waited 6 hours, face to face with death, because he was alone. However, Eric's survival demonstrated the incredible resilience of the human body. He remained upside down underwater for 6 hours and managed to escape from where he was trapped. His calmness, meditation, and oxygen conservation kept him alive. After recovering, Eric never dived alone again. "I should have died," he said, "but somehow I survived. Now, every time I dive, I remember those 6 hours. Loneliness means death underwater." Fontaine de Vaucluse is still there, waiting, silently and mysteriously, with its dark waters and deep tunnels. The miracle saved him, but next time, he might not be so lucky.